Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to spend this time with you. And my task, as I understand it, is to seed, if I may even use the word provoke, a conversation, which will be the lion's share of our time together. In the remarks that I'm going to offer to you, my hope is through both the experience I've had as a pastor, as well as my experience as a bishop and catechist, that I can offer some thoughts that will, in the time that we have, allow us to converse and discuss and perhaps share thoughts, and then give us food for thought well after this session is over. As Dr. Sullivan said, our topic today is as I term it, the empowerment and the engagement of parents in their divinely given role to be witnesses of the faith to their children and to be the bridges for their children to come into active worship. And as the papal magisterium for almost 50 years has been telling us, we talk about parents being the prime movers to allow their children to encounter Christ in a real, personal way, and encounter him over and over again, and to accompany them in their faith. So in my understanding, parents have a twofold role. First, to allow their children to be formed, to be co-agents of their formation so that they may choose discipleship. And once that is chosen, to accompany them into early adulthood so that they may then go in mission into the world. And the ultimate aim of all of that is to bring them as a living bridge to worship at the altar of Christ. Because it's at the Eucharist where we have the ultimate encounter with Christ, as well as we are, in a sense, fully accompanied by the community, which in my experience as a pastor, whether we're talking about a parish or a school or even a larger neighborhood, they are really communities forming a single community. And so, in effect, that's our topic. How do we empower parents to do this? Now, I'm going to state the obvious. This is a fault line in the modern church. You could speak to any bishop, any pastor, any school principal. This is an urgent question about not only the role of parents, but how do we empower them to do what the Lord is asking of them? One of the statements that may be a bit provocative, but the passing on of faith, when we gathered in Florida, Archbishop Fisichella spoke of the transmission of the faith, is broken in many places. And in family life, it seems to be under duress at best. And why is it an urgency? It's simply because if you look at a sociologist like Peter Berger, who created this theory on how societies are created, at the base of it, when you strip away all the jargon, when you look at the base insight, it's simply this, that a society that shares values, that does not pass those values on, by the third generation, that society is in crisis. So when we talk about the transmission of faith, the passing on of faith, and the role of parents, there is a huge urgency, because I don't believe this is judgmental on my part, please God, it's not. But there are many parents who have not had the opportunity to be formed and engage themselves, which is an urgent need, if they're going to do what we would like and ask of them in the name of Christ. So I like to do three things with you before we have our conversation. First, frame the issue. Secondly, to offer three guideposts that I believe are fundamental to the topic we are discussing. And then if I may take the liberty, number three is to offer some concrete suggestions on how we can empower and support parents in their role. And most of this is drawn from my own personal experience. So I'm hoping we'll have a lively conversation about all three, because I am certainly not the sole expert in this. There's much more expertise in your room than there is in this room. So let us frame the issue. It's clear we're living a moment of grace, because the new directory on catechesis is the context through which everything we should discuss must be seen as its reference point. And I'm not going to discuss the directory because I presume this is the heart of everything you are doing. So I'm presuming this. What I do want to alert you to the fact is that the bishops of the Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis have their own nomenclature based on the directory. And there's a phrase we have adopted called evangelizing catechesis. But that is really short term for the directory and its vision. So, of the elements you are already familiar, personal encounters, plural, with Jesus Christ, a proclamation of the charisma of salvation, that it is a response of faith, that is a moment of grace, that seeks conversion of mind, heart, and will within the community that accompanies a person to go out in mission as disciples. Those are the elements of our definition, our summary, which are many of the elements in the directory. But allow me to give you my own take. As I've reflected on this, I think the task at hand, both for parents and perhaps for all the members of the church in the Western world, but particularly in the United States, most particularly in the area that I am in, which is in New England here, is that the task can be understood as rebuilding a Catholic culture that fosters accompaniment and engagement. Now, by culture, I mean the accumulated experiences, individual and community, that mediates the presence of Christ in real and holistic ways, that includes the community as an essential transmitter of that culture. Now, why do I use that term? Okay, I do for 5 reasons, said quickly. First is that when we speak of formation, I use the term direct and indirect formation. When I look at my own life, direct is the intentional teaching and passing on of faith. It's an essential part of the transmission of the faith. We have traditionally understood that as cognitive understanding in the classroom. Important. But quite frankly, indirect formation are the other venues of grace that allow us to encounter Christ, that when I was a little boy, very much were a part of my experience, and many communities now, it's under duress or has collapsed completely. And I'm thinking of recreation, friendship, the own ethnic cultures that we have in difference with one another. We're talking about the celebration of the sacraments, the spiritual, the paraliturgical life, and I could go on and on and on. I call that the incubator of faith. Culture is meant to be this incubator of faith, and if it is Catholic, it will be the, if you will, the alternative to the secular culture that has created an incubator that is not in support of faith. That's number one. Second is saying that the family's role then is obvious as the incubator of faith. It's just simply obvious. And the interesting thing is, it's the role of the father that has taken on paramount importance, simply because the disaffiliation of the father leads to children being disaffiliated 5 times in greater numbers than if a mother is disaffiliated, which is a very interesting phenomenon for which I don't have a full explanation, but that is what the data is telling us. The third is, when we speak of culture, then we're speaking of encounter, and the encounter we seek is a full encounter with Christ. So if I may put it this way, when we say personal encounter, then we're talking cognitive, affective, and behavioral. The mind, the heart, the spirit, and will. And therefore, whenever we speak of empowering parents, one of the premises I'm going to speak of briefly later is we have to engage them the same way, holistically. It's not just an intellectual teaching of the faith, but what are the longings of their heart and how do we address them? What is it that they wish to be involved with? And since all behavior is driven by need, what are the needs they have? What do they perceive those needs to be? What are the needs they can't even name? That could all be venues for the encounter with Christ. And we could spend time breaking this open some more. The only thing I would say is, in the affective, the power of beauty is a tool we have not fully engaged. And it is a powerful transmitter of faith. And Dr. Sullivan, you shared with me one of your latest books about beauty, and I have to commend you for that. because I believe it is one of the prime movers among young people and young adolescents and young adults in an over-informationed, overextended, over-energized, and exhausted secular culture. And we could talk a lot about that, right? Okay. And I might say something else. When we talk about the will, we're talking about really truth, beauty, and goodness of the three principal transcendentals. When we talk about goodness, then we're talking about virtue, not service. Since grace builds our nature, which we'll talk about. Okay. The fourth element in a culture then is accompaniment and how community is formative. And small communities are brilliant as a formative presence. One of the things you will have to think through, as I try to think through, is how technology has altered community formation. So now communities can exist virtually, but many times they are self-selected, meaning that a community is not a given, it's created by the person who is the protagonist. And that therefore creates tribes, not communities. And some of the divisions we have in the church and in our Western culture is in part because we are becoming tribalized. And that's not what we are referring to in formation. We're talking about real community. And we could talk a bit about what that could look like. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. And lastly, when we speak of culture, and then the prime movers and audience of all our efforts need to be adults first, which the directory says clearly. The children are super important. Please don't get me wrong. But if the incubator of faith is not being animated by the adults of the community, then the children, whatever we give them, can easily die on the vine. And that, my friends, is dynamite in the pastoral life of this country, because I'm venturing to think that in the vast majority of our dioceses, the lion's share of our efforts have been catechizing young people, but not adults. And this is going to be a lion's share of our energies to shift to that. Okay, so that's the context. Briefly, the three fundamental guideposts. And the first may sound awfully judgmental, and it's not, again, not meant to be. And for those of you who do not know me, I'm a straight shooter. I always have been. I am from Brooklyn. It just is what it is. Okay. The only difference, this is the guidepost. Many times, the only difference between children and their parents is their chronological age. And the reason I say that is simply because there are millions of parents who have not had the opportunity for the formation that was their due from the very beginning. And we cannot expect parents to do what is beyond their capability of doing. And that is a very prudential, reflective question to ask. So therefore, whatever we do going forward, we have to be creative and innovative to provide the formational opportunities for parents so that they can be the prime witnesses of faith and the bridge to worship that engages mind, heart, will, and community. That's number one. The second is the recognition that encounter is the work of the Holy Spirit. You and I do not fabricate encounter. We create opportunities for encounter. But the Spirit is the one who moves my heart or your will or someone else's heart. And therefore, I almost imagine as we move forward to engage parents that we provide a multitude of opportunities for encounter. And by proper personal engagement, allow the Spirit to move them with the hope that if they're moved in one, they will eventually be introduced to all the doors of encounter. Because I keep using the word in the plural, not the singular. So therefore, one of the questions I would ask you to consider is, if I were to say to you, are parents the prime teachers of the faith? I'd be curious to see what your thought is of that, because for my purposes, in the new order, the translation of the order of baptism, there was an interesting change, because it is now parents are the first witnesses of the faith. And what does that mean in difference between the former translation and the current translation? And the third guidepost, if I may, is the power of beauty. Beauty. Now, I have a very expansive understanding of beauty, and it may not be totally correct. So I am very open to being corrected. But when I speak in my own mind, in my own reflection, when I think of prayer, I do not think of it as simply a cognitive act, but I believe it's also an exercise in beauty. It is a movement of the heart. It's, if I may put it, my heart with the divine heart. And there's a communication that occurs that does not need words. And therefore, the venue for that is beauty, whether it's art or literature or poetry or music. That those non-cognitive, or I may call supracognitive modalities that allow a person to sit in the presence of Christ. And then the Holy Spirit makes the introduction, if I could put it that way. Interestingly, my friends, when Catholic adults were asked by Cara, what is the one thing they asked of the church? They did not say they wanted to learn the faith. They said what the apostles said to Jesus: teach us how to pray. It's an interesting insight for us to chew over. And once again, if all pastoral counseling tells us all human behavior is driven by need, one of the questions we need to reflect on is, how do we awaken the need in a dormant heart, a weakened heart, a tired heart, a distracted heart, to the silence, to the reverence, to the awe and wonder we all have in confirmation, to encounter is a principal way of encountering Christ. Okay, so those are the three guideposts. Now some suggestions, if I may. The first is, we must discern what parents can be effectively and justly asked to offer their children in this enterprise of formation. If parents are agents of evangelization, and they are, to proclaim, introduce their children to the presence of Christ, the offer of life in him, and the invitation to enter into his mystical body. Having said all that, practically, if you could make the choice, what would you ask a parent to do? And I presume if we have time to bounce that question around, or you have a thought, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. I've asked it of my pastors, and I've gotten some very different responses. And if I may take the liberty, since I still have the podium, allow me to answer the question for you, for myself. First, I would ask parents to pray with their children in the rhythm of their life. Secondly, I would ask parents to intentionally live a life of virtue. That's demonstrative, that bears witness to human nature at its best, because that becomes the seedbed of grace. And the third is the topic here, and that is to make the deliberative choice to come to Mass with their children every Sunday, even if at first they do not have a personal felt need to go, to make an act of the will to go, and then determine, depending on the culture, ethnicity, size of the education, the size of the parish or community, how do you personally engage that parent or parents with this question of, well, why is this not a felt need? And oftentimes that goes into the question of story, the question of woundedness, the question of misunderstanding, many of what you and I see in life, the challenges we all face. Powerful way to empower a parent when they realize someone loves them enough to sit with them and talk with them and walk with them in the struggles of their life. And then I am optimistic enough to believe the need will be reawakened in time. The second is, we need to give parents a guidebook for their own spiritual growth. And believe it or not, the subcommittee on the Catechism, with the creation of the Institute on the Catechism, is making an historic shift. So we're going from protocols that were reactive, that judged catechetical materials, whether they were authentic and complete, vis-a-vis the Catechism. We're moving to an accompaniment model where publishers are going to be walked with by consultants in the very creation of the text. And what's the difference? And what's the difference between the two? The second model doesn't have a protocol, has a handbook. And it's going to be audacious enough to suggest affective, behavioral, and cognitive goals for the recipients, that is the children and young people, for catechists, and for parents in an age-appropriate way. So a parent can actually use the handbook to kind of gauge his or her own spiritual growth, which I'm hoping and praying will yield tremendous spiritual dividends. And that is why it's taking a while to get this drafted, because it can be a powerful tool for parents to answer the question, what's next? Like, what's my next step in the journey? And the last, and I'm now speaking as a pastor. When I was pastor of St. Dominic's in Brooklyn 1,000 years ago, when I look at my parish, I had a large Hispanic population, Italian-speaking population, and an Italian-American population. And I always imagined my parish as a community of faith. Now that I'm much older, I look back and I did not realize then what I realize now is that my parish was a community of communities of faith. Lots of them. Some come together because of vocation. Some come together because of interest. Some come together because of ministry. Some come together because of ethnicity. What I'm going to suggest as my last suggestion is, whether we're talking about a school, whether we're talking about a parish, whether we're talking about an ecclesial movement or community, or whatever else it may be, rather than create more, why don't we build the small communities that already exist by, I'm going to use the word, spiritualizing them, meaning that we bring to them the tools so that the encounter that we're talking about of truth, beauty, and goodness, that their existence as a community not be so narrow, but it becomes the seedbed for the accompaniment of its members, so that we don't have to create more communities. We have to empower the communities that already exist. So when they roll up to the Eucharist on Sunday, they're not rolling up as observers. They're rolling up as participants of the great mystery of what it is to be the church, of which we all have a role, but no one has all the roles. And for parents in particular, now, of course, I'm not a parent, for the record, okay? But for parents, what I see is that parents of like grade seem to form a community. 4th grade parents hang out, 7th grade parents, communion parents, confirmation parents, the baseball league parents, the basketball league parents. So those communities already exist. Many of them are far from what we're talking about. So can we imagine an intentionality that engages, strengthens forms, spiritualizes, educates, challenges, because that's the accompanying piece that's already there, all right, in seed for what we're talking about for parents. So I'm going to conclude because I want to leave the rest of the time for our conversation. In my own humble opinion, My friends, we are at a moment of pregnant opportunity. I use that word in particular. We are at a crossroads where the future in front of us can be extraordinarily exciting. But we need honesty to name the context correctly. We need courage to speak the truth to ourselves first as leaders, and we are all leaders in this room of catechesis. And then we need practicality and patience to accompany each other, and in particular the parents that are trusted to our care, to lead them to this ever-deepening encounters, accompany and engagement with the life of Christ and the life of the church. But I'm just going to end with this summary statement. I have never been more hopeful for the future of the church than I am right now. And I'm delighted that you and I can work together to realize that hope. Thank you for your attention.